The wagon creaked and moaned as it rolled to a halt at the edge of the clearing. The horses snorted, sides flecked with foam, weary from the long climb into the foothills of the Arizona Territory. Clara Hastings sat on the driver's bench, hands resting limply on the reins, eyes fixed on the vast sweep of land before her. It was rough, unbroken country, streaked with red rock and pines, alive with wind and silence. For the first time in months, she could hear herself think. The land looked wild enough to swallow her whole. Maybe that was what she wanted. A year ago, she'd had a home in Missouri, a whitewashed porch, a husband named Daniel, and the scent of lilacs in the spring. But fever had come like a thief, taking him in 3 nights. The farm was sold to pay debts, and Clara found herself with little more than a wagon, a few tools, and a restless ache she couldn't name. She had no children to hold her to the past, only the stubborn will to begin again somewhere no one knew her story. The Arizona Territory was barely tamed then, a place whispered about in newspapers and soldiers' letters, a frontier of danger and possibility. Clara had heard of land grants and open space, where a person could stake a claim with their own hands. She wanted that kind of freedom, even if it came wrapped in loneliness. She climbed down from the wagon, boots sinking into the sandy soil. The air was thin and dry, carrying the faint scent of juniper. The world stretched endlessly in every direction, distant mesas glowing gold in the setting sun, forests of ponderosa whispering like ghosts. The place felt empty but not dead, alive in a quiet, watchful way. "This is it," she said aloud, though no one was there to hear. Her voice startled even her. "This is where I'll stay." The first night she slept beneath the wagon, wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of home. Coyotes sang in the distance, their cries lonesome and sharp. The stars above seemed close enough to touch. She stared at them for hours, wondering if Daniel could see her from wherever he was. "I'll be all right," she whispered to the night. "I have to be." At dawn she rose and set to work. Her plan was simple: build a cabin before winter. She had an axe, a small saw, and the knowledge Daniel had taught her: how to notch a log, how to bind joints tight with clay. She dragged fallen branches at first, too afraid to fell a live tree. The effort tore at her muscles, raised blisters on her palms, and made her shoulders ache. But she welcomed the pain. It was proof she was still alive. Every sound made her heart jump: the rustle of wind through the trees, the far-off crack of a branch. She had heard stories of Apache bands moving through these hills, and of settlers who never returned from their claims. But she also knew that fear could paralyze faster than any enemy. So she kept her eyes open and her axe swinging. By the 3rd day she had cleared a rough square of ground for her cabin. The logs were uneven, but she didn't care. Each one she rolled into place was a small victory, a defiance against everything that had tried to break her. The wilderness pressed close, but she refused to yield. At night, when the fire burned low, she sometimes thought she felt eyes on her, some presence just beyond the trees. But when she turned to look, there was only wind and shadow. In truth, she was being watched. Far up the ridge, hidden among the rocks, an Apache warrior named Taza studied her through the narrow slit of a canyon opening. He had seen white settlers before, loud, careless ones who cut the forest as if it were theirs to command. But this woman was different. She moved with hesitation, respect. She took from the land only what she needed. Her fire was small. Her voice when she prayed was soft. Taza's people had lost much, his wife and child among them. The emptiness in his chest was an old wound, dulled by time but never healed. Watching her struggle against the earth stirred something long buried, a sense of recognition, of shared sorrow. He did not yet know her name, but he saw the same kind of strength that had once lived in the woman he'd loved. Below, Clara wiped sweat from her brow and looked up toward the ridge, feeling a chill despite the sun. Something in her sensed she was not alone. Yet, instead of fear, she felt oddly comforted, like the wilderness itself was keeping watch. She turned back to her work and hefted another log. One log at a time, she told herself. One log at a time until this place becomes home. High above the clearing, where the red rock rose like sleeping giants, Taza crouched among the pines, his gaze steady on the woman below. He had watched her for 5 days now, long enough to see that she was alone, long enough to understand she meant no harm. Still, he did not move closer. The world of white settlers and the world of the Apache had become divided by too much pain. A single misstep could mean blood. He told himself he was only watching to protect his people, to be certain this woman was not the first of many. But the truth was more complicated, more human. In her he saw echoes of his own solitude. The way she rose before dawn, her shoulders bowed beneath the work of cutting and hauling logs, reminded him of the time after his wife Nalin had died, when he too had built something from nothing, just to keep his hands from shaking with grief. Taza's eyes were keen. He saw how she paused at times to look toward the ridge, sensing the weight of his unseen presence. She would stand still for a heartbeat, her face soft with thought, then return to her labor. There was no panic in her movements, only awareness. That too he respected. A frightened person would have fled long ago. He studied her tools, her food stores, the small way she marked her ground. No rifle, only an axe and a small pistol. No sign of a man's shadow in her camp. No second set of tracks, no larger boots by the fire. She was truly alone, a strange thing for a white woman in this country. When the sun sank low, Taza descended quietly from his perch, moving like part of the wind. He circled the clearing from a distance, unseen. The wolves had begun to gather on the far ridge, their hunger sharp as the coming cold. They smelled her meat, her mule, her vulnerability. Taza frowned. A woman alone could not fight a pack. He whispered a short prayer to Usin, the life-giver, and knocked an arrow. That night the wolves came. Clara awoke to the sound of growls, low, circling. The fire had burned down to embers, and the night around her seemed alive with silver eyes. Her hand reached for the pistol by her blanket, but her fingers trembled too much to aim. One wolf stepped closer, its breath fogging in the moonlight. Then, a sharp whistle like a hawk's cry, and an arrow hissed through the dark. The wolf fell without a sound. The rest scattered, melting into the trees. Silence returned, broken only by the wind in the pines. Clara sat frozen, her breath quick and uneven. Someone had been there. Someone had saved her. In the morning, she found the arrow lodged in the earth where the wolf had fallen. The shaft was smooth, the feathers dyed a deep red, the kind she'd seen only once before, years ago, in a trade post. Apache make. Her stomach tightened, but not with fear. The arrow had been fired with precision, not malice. Whoever had sent it had chosen to protect, not harm. Up on the ridge, Taza watched her find the arrow. She turned it over in her hands, lips moving as though speaking to someone unseen. The rising sun touched her hair, turning it the color of honey. Taza looked away, a strange ache pressing against his chest. It had been 3 winters since he had lost his wife and child, to a fever that swept their camp. 3 winters since he had last spoken more than a few words to anyone outside his band. The loneliness had dulled his spirit, made him silent as stone. But now, watching the stranger, he felt the faint stirrings of something he thought long dead. Concern, curiosity, perhaps even hope. That evening, he followed her trail once more. He watched her haul the fallen logs she had spent the day cutting, her steps steady but slow. At the stream, she knelt to fill her bucket, the cool water splashing her arms. She paused to listen to a bird call, a thrush's trill, and smiled to herself. The sound of it startled him. He could not remember the last time he had seen someone smile without bitterness. He thought of approaching her then, of stepping out from behind the rocks and making himself known. But the memory of all that had come before, the raids, the broken treaties, the mistrust, held him back. The world between them was too fragile. One wrong move could turn curiosity into tragedy, so instead he stayed in the shadows. That night, when she doused her fire and lay down to sleep, Taza remained awake on the ridge, his bow across his knees. The wolves would not come again, not while he watched. He told himself he did this out of duty, out of respect for a brave soul surviving alone. Yet deep within, another truth stirred like an ember in the ashes. He watched because he was lonely too. By the 3rd week, Clara's hands were raw and cracked, her shoulders burning from labor. Every morning she rose before sunrise, when the air still held a thin bite of cold. The desert dawn was deceptive, rosy and calm at first before the heat came like a hammer. She had never known how relentless the sun could be until she felt it on her neck for 12 hours straight. No shade, no mercy. Still, she worked. Because work was the only thing that kept the memories from flooding in. Each log she lifted, each trench she dug was an act of defiance, against the past, against despair. She kept her husband's hat hanging from the wagon wheel, watching it sway in the wind as if Daniel himself were keeping an eye on her progress. "You'd laugh to see me now," she said one evening to the hat. "Me, building a home with my own 2 hands." Her laugh was thin, but it was the first sound of joy she'd made in months. The cabin was slowly taking shape, 4 low walls, uneven but solid. She'd lined the gaps with mud mixed with straw and stones. It was crude work, yet she felt pride when she stood inside the rectangle of her effort, looking at the sky through the unfinished roof. This, she thought, was what it meant to begin again, not waiting for rescue, not seeking permission, just enduring. But the wilderness had its own lessons to teach. The land was beautiful, but it demanded respect. One morning she woke to find her water barrel overturned, split open by something heavy. Bear tracks deep and wide circled the camp. Panic rose in her throat. She had heard stories of people mauled for less. She spent the rest of the day rebuilding her fire pit higher, scattering ashes around her food stores to mask the scent. That night she hardly slept, her pistol clutched tight beneath her blanket. From the ridge above, Taza watched her battle against the earth and its creatures. He saw her curse when her axe blade chipped against a stone, watched her fight to pull logs that were too heavy for her frame. At times he nearly stepped forward, his instincts urging him to help, but he always stopped. To her, his presence might bring more fear than comfort. Still, he found quiet ways to aid her. When she was gone one afternoon gathering wood, he crept close to her camp and set a snare farther out, near the edge of the clearing. By morning, a rabbit was caught in it. Fresh meat, she hadn't trapped herself. She found it, puzzled, and looked toward the ridge. The faintest smile curved her lips. "So it wasn't the angels after all," she murmured. "You're out there, aren't you?" The wind carried her words to where Taza crouched, and for the first time in months he smiled too. The days grew shorter, the nights colder. Clara worked faster now, knowing the frost would come soon. Her supplies were dwindling, and she'd learned the hard way that the soil here was stubborn, more rock than earth. The beans she planted refused to sprout. Her stomach growled often, but she ignored it. She'd known hunger before. What frightened her was the thought of failure, of building so much and then dying before it was done. One afternoon, as she struggled to lift a heavy log into place, her strength finally gave out. The log rolled, striking her leg and sending her to the ground. Pain shot through her ankle like fire. She cried out, the sound echoing through the pines. From the ridge, Taza tensed. He had heard that cry, the sharp, broken sound of pain that could not be faked. He hesitated only a heartbeat before moving. Like a shadow, he slipped down the slope, silent as a ghost. Clara, still gasping, tried to push herself up. The log pinned her foot. She grabbed a branch, tried to lever it, but her hands shook. Then, from the corner of her vision, movement, tall, dark, and quick. She froze. A man stepped from the trees, bow slung across his back, eyes steady and watchful. Apache. The same kind of arrow she'd found by the wolf. Her heart thundered in her chest, but he didn't raise his weapon. Instead, he reached down, lifted the log easily, and freed her foot. Clara stared, breathless. "You," she started, but he only held up his hand, palm outward. "Stay," he said softly in careful English. His voice was deep, calm, like water flowing over stone. She didn't move. He examined her ankle briefly, then pointed toward the fire pit. "Sit," he said. And when she obeyed, he turned and vanished back into the trees as silently as he had come. For a long moment, she sat trembling, unsure whether to be afraid or grateful. Then she looked toward the ridge again, where the trees swayed and the wind whispered between them. "Thank you," she said aloud, though she knew he could no longer hear her, from far above. Taza stood hidden among the pines, listening to her voice carry up the slope. He felt something inside him shift, like the thaw of long frozen ground. The land was harsh, yes, but perhaps it was not meant to break them. Perhaps it was meant to bring 2 lost souls to the same clearing, each struggling against the wilderness, and against the loneliness that lived deeper than any wound. The morning after the stranger's silent rescue, Clara's camp felt different, alive somehow with an invisible presence. The forest seemed to breathe around her, each whisper of pine and rustle of leaf carrying the sense of unseen eyes. Yet it wasn't fear that stirred in her chest anymore. It was something gentler, curiosity and a quiet comfort she could neither name nor explain. Her ankle throbbed, swollen but not broken. She wrapped it tight with a strip of cloth torn from her skirt, then limped to the stream for water. The air was cold and crisp, a thin mist rising from the surface. She felt watched again and paused mid-step, the tin bucket trembling in her hand. Across the stream, among the dark trees, a bird fluttered suddenly, a flash of blue feathers. Nothing else moved. "Thank you," she said softly to the empty woods, as though they might answer. That afternoon, when she returned to her work, she found something unexpected at the edge of the clearing, a bundle of wild herbs tied neatly with a strip of deer hide. Sage yarrow and willow bark. She recognized them from her husband's old medical kit. Pain relievers, healing herbs. Whoever had left them knew exactly what she needed. She looked toward the ridge, heart fluttering. He was still watching. That night she added the herbs to boiling water and soaked her ankle in the fragrant steam. The ache eased and a strange calm settled over her. She should have been frightened by the knowledge that someone was moving unseen around her camp. Yet there was no malice in the air, no sense of danger. It was as if the wilderness itself had decided to take pity on her, perhaps guided by one of its own. Up on the ridge, Taza watched her bathe her foot, his dark eyes reflecting the glow of her fire. He was careful not to move too close. Among his people there were rules, unspoken boundaries between the Apache and the white settlers. But this woman, she defied the expectations he had known all his life. She treated the land with reverence, not greed. She spoke to it, even sang softly when she worked, as if trying to make peace with the earth itself. He found himself drawn to her voice in ways he didn't understand. He thought of his late wife, Nalan, whose laughter had once filled his home like birdsong. She too had spoken kindly to the land, believing all living things were spirits deserving of respect. Watching the white woman below, Taza felt the faint echo of that lost harmony. The ache of loneliness in his chest deepened, but it no longer felt hollow. It felt alive. Days passed. Clara's cabin walls rose higher, one log at a time. Each morning she woke to find small signs that she wasn't truly alone. The firewood neatly stacked by her door, a bundle of fish left on a flat stone near the stream, a broken tool mended overnight with sinew and care. Once she even found a new flint blade lying beside her dull knife, sharper and finer than any she'd owned. She held it up to the sun and smiled. "So," she whispered, "my ghost has a generous heart, but she wasn't foolish." She knew who the ghost truly was, the man who had lifted the log from her leg and disappeared before she could thank him. An Apache, proud and silent, living in the same wilderness that had nearly defeated her. She'd heard stories about his people from travelers and soldiers, stories of raids and savagery. But the man who had saved her hadn't looked like a monster. He'd looked human. Tired, perhaps, but kind. That night, as the fire crackled low, she took a piece of cornbread and a small pouch of dried fruit and placed them on the same flat rock where she'd found the fish. "For you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For what you've done." When she woke the next morning, the food was gone. In its place lay a single eagle feather, white-tipped with brown, a symbol she did not recognize but somehow understood. A gift, a wordless acknowledgement, gratitude, or perhaps friendship. Up on the ridge, Taza turned the cornbread over in his hands before eating it slowly, savoring the unfamiliar sweetness. He had not shared a meal with anyone since Nalan's passing. For a fleeting moment, the simple act filled him with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. When he placed the feather on the stone, it was not just a gesture of thanks. It was a promise. He would watch over her for as long as she stayed. As autumn deepened, the nights grew sharper. Clara kept her fire burning longer, and more than once she caught herself speaking into the darkness as if to a companion unseen. "You and I," she said one night, stirring the fire with a stick, "we seem to understand each other. Maybe we both lost too much." The flame snapped softly in reply. From the shadows beyond the firelight, Taza stood listening, the wind tugging at his long hair. He wanted to step forward to show himself, to say something more than the few words he had used. But not yet. The time was. The storm came without warning. One moment the sky was a clean, endless blue. The next, black clouds boiled up over the ridge like smoke from an unseen fire. Clara had barely enough time to lash her tools under the wagon before the first drop struck, fat, cold, and heavy as stones. Thunder rolled down the valley, echoing through the canyons like the drum of war. She ran for her half-built cabin, clutching her shawl to her chest. The wind tore at her hair and skirts, stinging her face with grit. The roof was unfinished, just a frame of beams, and the storm wind ripped through it mercilessly. She tried to tie a sheet of oilcloth over the open rafters, but the wind caught it like a sail and nearly dragged her off her feet. Her axe clattered to the ground, swallowed by mud. The rain came harder, turning the clearing into a churn of slick earth. One of the corner logs shifted under the force of the storm and began to tilt, threatening to collapse the fragile wall she had labored weeks to build. Clara braced her shoulder against it, teeth gritted, pushing with every ounce of strength. "No," she cried aloud. "Not now. Please, not now." Lightning split the sky, white and violent. For an instant she saw a figure moving through the rain, tall, broad-shouldered, steady against the storm. She blinked, half-blinded by light, and when she looked again, he was there. Taza. He came from the tree line like a vision carved from the storm itself, his long dark hair plastered to his face, his deerskin shirt soaked through. In his hands he carried a thick branch he'd fashioned into a brace. Without a word he jammed it under the sagging wall, throwing his weight against it. The logs groaned but held. Clara stared, breathless, rain streaming down her face. "You," she began, but the wind tore the word away. "Hold there," Taza said simply, his voice low but commanding. He motioned for her to step back, then adjusted the brace until the wall steadied. His movements were swift, sure, those of a man who knew how to fight the land and win. They worked together without speaking. Clara fetched rope from the wagon while Taza secured the structure. Each time their eyes met, something wordless passed between them. Recognition, trust, and something else neither dared name. By the time the storm began to ease, the cabin stood upright, battered but unbroken. When at last the rain slowed to a steady drizzle, Clara collapsed onto a log, exhausted. Her skirts clung to her legs, her hands raw from rope burns. Taza stood nearby, breathing hard but composed, his dark eyes scanning the clearing as though still expecting danger. "Thank you," she said quietly. Her voice shook, not from fear but from relief. Taza inclined his head slightly. "You are safe," he said, his accent rough but his English clear. You fixed the wall." He shrugged. "Wind is strong. Alone it wins." The simplicity of his words struck her. "Alone it wins." She nodded slowly. "Yes," she murmured. "It does." For a moment they stood in silence, listening to the drip of rain through the trees. The air smelled of wet pine and earth. Clara wanted to say more, to ask him who he was, where he came from, but something in his expression stopped her. He looked as if he belonged to another world, one that did not often cross paths with hers. Still, she found her courage. "I think you've been watching me," she said softly. Taza didn't deny it. His gaze flicked toward the ridge. "You work hard," he said. "You do not take more than you need." "The land sees this," she smiled faintly. "Is that why you helped me? Because the land told you to?" A hint of amusement touched his lips, the barest ghost of a smile. "The land speaks to all who listen." Clara looked down at her hands, then back up at him. "Then I'm grateful it sent you." For the first time, he met her eyes fully. Something shifted there, an understanding that bridged more than language. It was brief but enough. He gestured toward her ankle, still bandaged. "Better?" "Better," she said. "Because of you." He nodded once, then turned as if to go. Panic flickered in her chest. "Wait," she said, rising unsteadily. "Will I see you again?" Taza paused at the edge of the trees. "The land decides," he said simply, and then he was gone, swallowed by the forest, as if the storm had carried him away. Clara stood in the clearing long after, the rain dripping from her hair, the storm clouds breaking open to reveal the first threads of sunlight. Her cabin still stood, her heart still beat, and for the first time since Daniel's death she felt something other than grief. Hope. The storm left the air sweet and clean. The ground drank deep, and for days afterward the hills were rich with scent, wet earth, pine resin, and the faint perfume of blooming yucca. Clara's cabin had survived, though battered, and in the calm that followed the storm, she found her thoughts constantly drifting toward the man who had helped her stand against it, the Apache, Taza. He had appeared like the wind, silent, strong, and then gone. But the memory of his eyes lingered in her mind, steady as the mountains themselves. She had lived alone for months, spoken only to herself and to the wilderness. Now every sound in the woods made her wonder if he was near again. 3 days passed before she saw him. She was at the stream washing a blanket when a shadow moved between the trees. Her heart gave a quick leap. He stepped into view slowly this time, no longer a ghost, but a man of flesh and bone. The morning light touched his face, sharp features, calm eyes, the color of warm earth. "You came back," she said, more to herself than to him. Taza inclined his head. "You are well?" he asked carefully, his English halting but gentle. "I am," she said, setting the blanket aside. The cabin held. "Because of you." He said nothing, only gave a short nod. She could see he wasn't used to conversation with settlers, perhaps not with anyone for some time. His silence, though, was not cold. It was measured, respectful. Clara gestured toward the clearing. "Would you like some food? I still have a bit left from the cornmeal." He hesitated. Among his people, sharing food was sacred, an act that bound spirits together. But the look in her eyes was earnest, not demanding. He followed her back to the cabin. She served him a small bowl of stew, thin but warm, and a piece of cornbread. He ate slowly, silently. She noticed how he bowed his head briefly before the first bite, a habit that felt more prayer than ritual. She found herself doing the same. After a while, she broke the silence. "You speak English well?" He looked up, faint amusement flickering across his face. "Some words. Learned long ago from a soldier who did not want to fight." Clara smiled faintly. "That sounds like a good man." Taza nodded once. He was tired of war. For a time they spoke in fragments, piecing together meanings through gestures and patience. When her words failed, she drew in the dirt, simple pictures of the things around them, tree, river, sun. He corrected her, teaching her the Apache words softly, his voice like wind moving through reeds. "Dolly for bluebird, to for water. She for me." When he said you, he touched his chest and then gestured toward her. Repeating, "Ni, ni," she echoed carefully. He smiled then, an open, unguarded smile that transformed his face. Clara felt something flutter inside her chest, strange and new, and looked quickly away. Their lessons became a rhythm. Each time he visited, he would bring something useful. A coil of rawhide, a handful of berries, once even a smooth stone knife carved with delicate etchings. In return, she offered food, or sometimes a small handmade gift, a stitched cloth, a polished cup. They spoke more with hands and eyes than with words. When she tried to explain the concept of loneliness, she pressed her palm to her heart, then spread her fingers toward the sky. He watched her for a long time before nodding. "Loneliness," he said quietly. "Same word in my heart." That simple exchange hung between them for the rest of the day. As the weeks passed, their silences grew comfortable. Sometimes he would sit by her fire as she worked on the cabin's roof or mended clothes. He rarely touched anything, always careful, as though her home was a sacred place. But his presence filled the emptiness around her, grounding her. She began to ask him about the land, where to find wild onions, which tracks belonged to deer or cougar. He showed her by gesture, drawing in the dirt with a stick. When she laughed at her own clumsiness, he smiled again and once even laughed, a deep, warm sound that startled them both. One evening, as the sun sank behind the red mesas, Clara handed him a small book of psalms she had kept from her old life. He turned the pages gently, tracing the printed letters with a finger. "You read this?" he asked. "Yes," she said softly. "When I'm afraid or lonely." He nodded thoughtfully, then closed it with care. "Words have power," he said. "Your God listens. My spirits listen too." Clara looked at him surprised. "Maybe they listen together." Taza met her gaze, something deep and unspoken in his eyes. "Maybe," he said. The fire crackled between them. The wilderness that had once divided them now seemed smaller, gentler, its silence filled not with distance, but with understanding. They didn't yet know it. But in those slow exchanges of word and glance, something was being built between them, steady and strong. Not a cabin this time, something deeper. Autumn deepened across the valley, painting the ridges in shades of gold and rust. The air carried a crisp bite that whispered of snow in the high mountains. Clara had nearly finished her cabin. Only the door remained unhinged, the roof in need of one final row of logs. Each morning she woke to frost on the grass, her breath visible in the chill. Yet she felt less alone than she had since leaving Missouri. Taza came often now, not every day, but often enough that his absence felt like a shadow when he wasn't there. He never arrived unannounced. Somehow she always sensed when he was near. A stillness would come over the forest, and moments later, he would step into the clearing, quiet and steady as dawn. They shared simple things: a fire, a meal, a story told through broken English and soft Apache words. It was in those quiet evenings, when the flames threw long shapes against the cabin walls, that Clara began to glimpse the sorrow behind his calm eyes. One such night, after a day spent gathering kindling, she offered him a bowl of stew. He ate slowly, as always, but his gaze was distant, drawn to something beyond the firelight. "You are thinking," she said softly, "of something far away?" He looked up and for a long moment did not answer. Then he nodded. "Of before," he said. "Of my family." Clara hesitated. "Your family?" He stirred the fire with a stick, eyes reflecting the ember glow. "Long time ago, I had a wife, a son, small." He held his hand a few feet from the ground. "Both gone now." Her heart clenched. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. He nodded once, his expression unreadable. "The sickness came after a harsh winter. Medicine could not help. They sleep now with the ancestors." Clara didn't speak. There was a deep reverence in his tone, not self-pity, but acceptance, the kind that only came from living with grief so long it became part of the soul. Finally, he looked at her. "You too," he said gently. "You carry loss." The word struck like an arrow through soft earth. She blinked back sudden tears. "Yes," she said. "My husband, Daniel. Fever took him last spring. He was kind. He believed we'd grow old together." Her voice broke. But life had other plans. For a long time, neither spoke. The fire crackled softly between them. Above, the stars spread across the sky like spilled salt. Taza's voice came quiet and steady. "When my wife left this world, I walked into the hills. I wanted the mountains to take me. But the wind said no." He looked toward the trees. "The land still needed me. The spirit said I must wait. For what, I did not know." Clara swallowed hard. Maybe for this." He turned to her, brow furrowed. "For what's here," she said. "For another chance to build something that lasts." He studied her for a moment, then gave a slow nod. "Maybe." She smiled faintly through her tears. "Daniel used to say that the world is full of ghosts. Only some wear faces we can still see." Taza tilted his head, considering. "Then we both walk with ghosts," he said. "But maybe now. They walk beside us, not behind." Those words settled into her heart like warmth spreading through cold fingers. For a long time they sat together, watching the flames dance lower until only embers remained. Before leaving, Taza stood and looked at her cabin, the rough-hewn logs, the smoke curling gently from the roof. "You build strong," he said. "Not just with hands. With heart." She looked up at him. "I couldn't have done it without you." He shook his head. "You could, but I am glad you did not have to." When he disappeared into the forest, she stood at her doorway a long time, listening to the whisper of leaves. The ache in her chest was still there, but it had changed. Softer, shared. In the days that followed, she found herself talking to him more, asking about his people, his language, his beliefs. He told her of the spirits of the wind and the river, of how every stone and animal carried a memory. She told him of her God, of prayer, of forgiveness. They didn't try to convert each other. Instead, they found comfort in the overlap, the belief that both worlds, his and hers, were watched over by something larger than grief. One night, as the fire burned low, Taza reached out and touched the small cross she wore on a cord around her neck. His fingers brushed it gently, reverently. "This," he said, "is your way of remembering?" She nodded. "And hoping," he smiled faintly. "Then keep both. Remembering and hoping. They are the same road." And for the first time since she'd buried Daniel, Clara believed him. By late November, frost silvered the grasses at dawn, and the mountains wore a thin veil of snow. The air had turned sharp, carrying the scent of cedar smoke and pine. Clara rose each morning with her breath fogging before her hands stiff but steady. Her cabin, her home, was nearly done. The final week was a blur of work and wonder. The roof was sealed, the walls caulked tight against the wind. Taza had carved wooden pegs to hold the door hinges, shaping them with a patience she admired. When the door finally swung shut for the first time, the sound, solid, final, satisfying, brought tears to her eyes. She laughed, wiping them away. "It's real," she said, turning to him. "I actually did it." Taza stood at her side, his expression calm but proud. "You built strong," he said simply. "The storm will not take it." Inside, the cabin smelled of fresh-cut wood and earth. The small window she'd made with scraps of oiled parchment glowed amber with the afternoon light. Against the far wall, she had built a narrow cot covered with a quilt, patched and faded, the last remnant of her old life. On a shelf sat her few treasures: Daniel's pocket Bible, a tin cup, and the eagle feather Taza had given her weeks before. Taza ran his fingers over the carved lintel of the doorway, tracing the grain of the wood. "This place," he said quietly, "it remembers your hands." She looked around the small room, her heart swelling with both pride and humility. "And yours," she said softly. He met her gaze, something flickering behind his calm. "Maybe," he said almost to himself, "this is how healing begins." That evening they built a fire in the stone hearth she had stacked herself. The warmth filled the cabin, chasing away the cold. Outside, wind whispered through the pines, but inside there was peace, the kind that came not from silence but from company. They shared a meal of roasted rabbit and wild onions. It wasn't much, but it tasted better than anything Clara could remember. "Do your people build homes like this?" she asked between bites. Taza nodded slightly. "Different wood, different hands, but same heart," she smiled. "I think hearts are what really make a home." He looked at her then, not quickly, not shyly, but with the depth of a man who had spent years looking only at the horizon and had finally found something worth seeing up close. For a moment, neither spoke. When the fire burned low, Taza rose and took something from the small pouch at his belt. He handed it to her, a carved wooden pendant shaped like a mountain hawk. "For protection," he said. "My wife made the first one long ago. I carved this when she passed." Clara took it gently, her throat tight. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Are you sure you want me to have it?" He nodded. "You have built a home in a place where the land tests all who stay. You will need strength." Her fingers brushed his as she accepted the pendant. For an instant, warmth surged between them, unexpected but not unwelcome. Outside, the night deepened. The stars shone brighter here than anywhere she'd lived before. Through the small window, she could see them scattered like silver across the black. "Daniel used to say the stars were God's lanterns," she murmured. Taza followed her gaze. "My people say they are the fires of those who came before us. They watch so we do not forget." Clara smiled faintly. "Maybe we're both right." He inclined his head. "Maybe the same fire burns in both skies." They sat quietly for a long while after that. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the sigh of the wind against the cabin walls. For Clara, it was the first true peace she'd felt since the world had taken her husband. Not the absence of sorrow, but the presence of something gentler in its place. Companionship, perhaps even hope. When Taza finally stood to leave, she followed him to the door. The moonlight lay silver on the clearing, the world still and perfect. "You'll come back?" she asked softly. He paused, then gave a small nod. "The land still calls me to the hills," he said. "But I will return when it whispers your name." Clara watched as he disappeared into the trees, his figure blending into shadow. She pressed the hawk pendant to her heart and closed the door behind her. For the first time, the cabin truly felt like home. Not because it sheltered her from the world, but because it connected her to it. And though she didn't know it yet, that night marked the beginning of something deeper, a new kind of building, made not from logs and nails, but from trust, kindness, and the quiet mending of two broken hearts. Winter's breath came early that year. The wind sharpened along the ridges, carrying flecks of snow that glimmered in the air like dusted glass. Clara's cabin, sturdy and warm, stood as a testament to the months of work and the strange companionship that had grown between her and Taza. He came and went with the rhythm of the land, sometimes gone for days, tracking elk or visiting his people far to the south. But each time he returned, Clara felt the world settle again, as though the air itself had been waiting for him. They spoke more now, her words softer, his English steadier, and laughter came easier. But peace in that wild country was a fragile thing. It was early one afternoon when she first sensed the change. The woods, usually filled with birdsong and wind, had gone unnaturally quiet. Even the creek seemed to hush. She was gathering wood near the edge of the clearing when the faint jingle of spurs reached her ears. She froze. Then, From between the trees, 3 riders emerged. Men in dust-caked coats and wide-brimmed hats, their eyes hidden under the shade. The lead rider, a thin man with a scar that split his upper lip, grinned when he saw her. "Well, look what we've got here," he drawled. "A lady settler all alone." Clara's heart pounded. "I'm not alone," she said, forcing calm. The man laughed. "Sure you ain't." His eyes flicked to the cabin. "Fine little place you've got. Bet there's good supplies in there too. Maybe more." One of the others, broad-shouldered with a patchy beard, spat into the dirt. "Ain't no law out here. What's to stop us?" Clara's hand inched toward the axe by the woodpile. "Leave now," she said, her voice shaking but steady. "There's nothing for you here." Scarlip chuckled, nudging his horse closer. "You're brave, lady. Foolish, but brave. Maybe you got someone out here? A husband?" Before she could answer, a voice came from the trees. He said, "Leave." The riders turned sharply. From the shadowed pines, Taza stepped forward, silent as mist, bow in hand, an arrow already notched. His expression was calm, but his eyes were hard, unflinching. Scarlip sneered. "A savage," he spat. "You keeping company with them now, miss?" Taza didn't move. "Go," he said again. The leader's smile twisted. "We ain't scared of your kind." He drew his gun, fast, careless, but Taza was faster. The bowstring sang. The arrow struck the man's wrist and his revolver clattered to the ground. The horse reared, whinnying in panic. The other 2 scrambled for their guns, but Taza had already shifted, drawing another arrow before they could aim. "Enough," Clara shouted, stepping between them. "Leave now!" For a moment no one moved. Then, seeing the steadiness in Taza's stance and the fierce resolve in Clara's eyes, the men hesitated. Scarlip cradled his bleeding wrist, glaring with fury and humiliation. "This ain't over," he snarled. "You'll regret this." Taza's voice was cold and final. "If you come again, you will not leave." The men turned their horses, retreating into the trees, their curses fading with the wind. Clara stood frozen, her breath ragged until they were gone. When silence returned, she turned to Taza. "You could have killed him." He lowered his bow. "He would have killed you." Her hands trembled as the truth of that sank in. She stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." He looked at her, and for a long moment neither spoke. The fire in his eyes softened, replaced by something deep, protective, but more than that. "Those men," she said. "They'll come back." Taza nodded slowly. "Yes, but next time we will be ready." That night they reinforced the cabin together. Shutters secured, supplies hidden, rifles checked. Taza taught her how to listen for danger, how to move quietly through the brush, how to read the signs in the dirt that spoke of who had passed before. When the moon rose high, they sat by the fire inside, the door barred against the cold. Clara looked at him across the flickering light. "I used to think the hardest thing was building this cabin," she said softly. "Now I see the hardest thing is keeping what you've built safe." Taza's gaze held hers. "All things worth keeping," he said, "must be protected. Even hearts." The words settled between them like an unspoken vow. Outside, the wind howled around the cabin walls, but within those 4 log walls, built by her hands, guarded by his, something stronger than fear took root. They were no longer just a woman and a warrior sharing the wilderness. They were 2 souls standing together against the dark. Winter settled hard upon the valley. The wind sang through the trees like a mourning flute, snow blanketing the world in white silence. Clara's cabin stood steady against it all, warm, smoke curling from the chimney, a tiny ember of life in a vast wilderness. It had been weeks since the riders' attack. They hadn't returned, though every sound beyond the clearing kept Clara alert. Every shadow tested her courage. Yet fear no longer ruled her. Taza's presence, whether seen or felt, was a shield stronger than any wall. He stayed longer now, sometimes through the night, sleeping by the hearth with his blanket pulled tight. The first time she had offered him a place to rest inside, he hesitated, eyes lowered in respect. But when the snow fell heavy and the cold grew bitter, she said simply, "You built this cabin as much as I did. There's room for both of us." And so he stayed. Days turned into a rhythm of small labors and quiet companionship. They hunted together, repaired tools, and shared stories by firelight. When words failed, gestures filled the silence. Sometimes laughter did. One morning, after a long snowfall, Clara opened the door to a world transformed, snow piled knee-deep, the trees heavy with white. Taza stepped beside her, his breath visible in the cold. "It is beautiful," she said. He nodded. "The land sleeps now. But spring will come," she smiled faintly. "It always does." He turned to her, and for a long moment the world held still. His gaze was gentle but searching, as though seeing not just her face but the story it carried. The loss, the courage, the quiet strength. "You have changed," he said softly. Clara met his eyes. "So have you." He hesitated, then said, "When I lost my wife, I closed my heart. The wind spoke, but I did not listen. The earth gave signs, but I turned away. I thought my path ended in the mountains." She waited, her hands folded before her. "But then," he continued, "I saw a woman building a cabin, alone, unafraid. The Spirit said, 'She builds more than a home. She builds her heart again.' And I—" His voice grew quiet. "I began to build mine too." Clara's throat tightened. "Taza." He stepped closer, his hand hovering near hers, not touching, but close enough that the warmth bridged the space between them. "We both lost what we loved," he said. "But maybe the land has given something back." The words filled her like sunlight. She reached out, her fingers brushing his. "Maybe it has." For a long time, neither spoke. The wind sighed through the trees, and a hawk called somewhere in the distance, the same kind as the one on the pendant that hung against her chest. Later that evening, as dusk fell, they lit 2 fires outside the cabin, one for her people, one for his. The flames rose together, twin beacons in the snow. Taza explained softly, "In my tribe we light fire for remembrance. One for those who came before, one for those who walk beside us." Clara knelt beside him, the warmth painting her face gold. "In my faith," she said, "we light candles for the same reason. For love that never dies." He smiled faintly. "2 fires," he said, "same sky." They watched in silence as the flames danced higher, the smoke twisting upward into the star-swept night. For a moment it felt as though the heavens themselves bowed to watch, their ancestors, their lost loves, the spirits of the mountains. When the fires burned low, Clara looked at him. "What happens when spring comes?" she asked quietly. Taza was silent for a while. Then he said, "Spring means choice. You can go east, back to your people, or you can stay." She studied his face, the strong lines softened by firelight, the eyes that had watched over her more faithfully than she could ever have asked. "This land took almost everything from me," she said slowly. "But it also gave me this home, and you." He didn't move, but his breath caught. "Just barely, I think," she said, smiling gently. "I'll stay." Taza's lips curved, small but real, a smile that spoke of gratitude deeper than words. "Then spring will be good," he said. When they went inside, the cabin welcomed them with the scent of smoke and pine. She set another log on the fire. The light flickered across the walls, across their faces. Clara sat beside him, the quiet between them full of meaning. She thought of Daniel, and of the woman Taza had lost, and of how both their lives had broken, and somehow, piece by piece, had been rebuilt in this wild, unyielding land. The cabin creaked softly in the wind. Outside, the twin fires dwindled to embers. Glowing faintly against the snow, Taza reached over, his hand finding hers. 2 souls, once haunted by loss, now held in the same stillness, beneath the same endless forgiving sky. And in that small cabin, built 1 log at a time, a new story had quietly begun. And for the first time, Clara felt not just safe but belonged.